This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason. In this episode 853 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. With the holidays, the Late Round Podcast schedule, it's going to look different next week. I'm going to be doing the 15 Transaction Show on Tuesday, but it's going to drop later on the day Tuesday. I won't be working on Christmas. But then rather than this 10 Trends episode, I'll be skipping it and working on the Sleepers episode for Thursday morning. Those are the two episodes that are dropping next week for Championship Week. I don't podcast for Week 18 because the vast majority of leagues are done by then. But that makes this the last 10 Trends episode of the season. I'll do my best to make it a good one. DeAndre Swift has scored single-digit PPR points in 4 straight games. I've talked about him a bit over the last month and a half, and he's definitely disappointed. Now, the reason to have been bullish on Swift was the playoff schedule. He unfortunately didn't come through with a big outing in Week 15. He scored 9.5 PPR points, but he was close to a totally fine day. He fell just short of the end zone. The good news is that his running back rush share in that game against Seattle was 75%. That's his highest in 3 weeks. His target share, it was solid enough at 10%. And his route participation, it was its highest that it's been since Week 7. I still like Swift more than the consensus over the next 2 weeks, because the peripherals aren't as bad as the numbers suggest. It feels like not enough people are talking about Isaiah Likely. Over his last 3 games, he's seen target shares of 20%, 17.5%, and 26%. His route participation over his last 4, that's without Mark Andrews for the most part, it's been elite. According to Fantasy Life's utilization report, Likely has seen route rates of 88%, 83%, 91%, and 88% during this time. To me, even though the schedule could be better, he's a tight end 1 in Week 16 and 17. James Cook is cooking. And you might be wondering, has anything actually changed? Is he just getting lucky? Well, one thing that's happening is that since Joe Brady took over as offensive coordinator, Cook has been used more as a receiver. With Ken Dorsey, Cook's target share per game rate was 8.2%. Without him, it's 16.3%. He's not really running more routes. He's just been targeted at a much higher rate. Clearly, the Bills are making a point to get him the ball. And there's also this from my friend Jim Sonis from FanDuel. Jim tweeted earlier this week that Cook's snap rate inside the 12-yard line with Ken Dorsey was 29%. With Joe Brady, it's 55%. So it's still not perfect, but Cook is getting more of those higher leverage looks. That's why he's become such a league-winning type player. Now, speaking of the Bills without Ken Dorsey, how about Gabe Davis? During the 4 games that Davis has played with Joe Brady as offensive coordinator, he scored a grand total of 22.5 PPR points. All of those points came in 1 game. That's right. He scored 0 points in 3 of his last 4. His route participation really hasn't shifted that much. His target share has. He's seen a 9.4% target share per game rate during this time. That number was over 16% before the coordinator switch. You absolutely cannot trust Gabe Davis in the fantasy playoffs. Of course he's capable of a big play, maybe even a monster week, but it's so risky at this point. If Devon Achane is going to get back to his early season production, he's going to need to see more work on the ground. In weeks 14 and 15, he saw running back rush shares of 25% and 35%. Earlier in the season, that number was closer to 50%. Now, maybe this has to do with his injury, but there is some good news regardless. His route participation over his last 3 has been pretty good. The Dolphins seem to be focusing his workload through pass catching, that side of things. And with tough matchups against Dallas and Baltimore to close out the fantasy season, that might not be a bad thing for Achane. If Miami hits a negative game script, we might see more of him. I've mentioned it before, but I love Justin Fields in the fantasy football playoffs. Mostly because he's been running the ball a lot, and he also had a great Week 16 and Week 17 schedule. And I still believe that to be true. He had a tough game against Cleveland this past week, and we all knew that was coming. I had talked about that on the show. But in Week 16 and in Week 17, he gets Arizona and Atlanta. Those are 2 favorable opponents. Fields has played 5 matchups this season against defenses that rank as bottom half opponents by adjusted points allowed. In those games against tougher opponents, he's averaged 10.1 standard fantasy points per game. That's pretty horrific. In his 5+ matchups, though, that average goes from 10.1 to 24.3. Justin Fields has a chance to really help fantasy managers over the next 2 weeks. Aaron Jones returned for the Packers in Week 15, and honestly, he had pretty good usage. Now, his snap share was oddly only 48%. We know the Packers typically split their backfield, but that was still a little bit low for Aaron Jones. The good news is that he handled 87% of Green Bay's running back rushes. That was by far a season high. And then he had an 11% target share, which was also strong. I'd anticipate his participation to get a little bit better as long as he's healthy. We know he's a good player when he's healthy. I wouldn't sleep on him with the Panthers upcoming in Week 16. I'm not sure people realize how good David Njoku has been in fantasy during the second half of the season. Since Week 8, Njoku's averaging 15.5 PPR points per game. The only tight ends who have been better in points per game during this stretch, Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, and TJ Hawkinson. Njoku has more points per game than every other tight end. And it's no fluke either. His target share per game rate during this time, 25%. Cleveland has the 5th best tight end schedule in Week 16 and 17 when looking at adjusted points allowed. I'm not sure why we'd assume that this production just comes to a halt. James Conner ended up with a strong 17.9 PPR point outing in Week 15, but we've now seen him fail to hit a 50% snap share in 2 of his last 3. 2 of those games were pretty big blowouts, and in those blowout games, his route participation, it hovered the 30% mark. In the game that they won against Pittsburgh, it was 56%. They didn't use Conner more in that game against the Steelers because of some revenge game factor. They used him more because of game script. Now, fortunately, Arizona gets Chicago this week. There's at least a chance they can keep that game close. Therefore, Conner might be okay. But they get Philadelphia in Week 17. That type of matchup's pretty scary for a player like Conner and how he's being used. The last trend this week is about the Detroit Lions backfield. David Montgomery returned from injury in Week 10, and he and Jahmyr Gibbs have played 6 games together since then. In those 6 games, Gibbs is averaging 17.9 PPR points per game. Montgomery's still been good. He has 14.1 PPR points per game. Here's the crazy thing though. According to Next Gen Stats, during this time frame, Jahmyr Gibbs has played 61% of the team's red zone snaps when David Montgomery is at 37%. Gibbs has played 2 more snaps than David Montgomery within the 3-yard line. Again, that's according to Next Gen Stats. Jahmyr Gibbs is doing what we drafted him to do. He's giving us awesome fantasy production. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.